Hi, thanks for joining. In this video, we're going to talk about custom loopbacks, which are an advanced pattern that you can build into your DataForge workspace. The benefit of a custom loopback is that it allows you to automatically trigger a custom ingestion after your virtual output completes, as opposed to a typical loopback, which will wait for the virtual output to complete and then ingest that exact output SQL view that's created. And so if we get started and we're looking at our DataForge workspace, the first thing that we're going to want to do is go to outputs and make sure that we've got a virtual output created so that we can work with that. So I have one existing already for Sales Nation data. And if we look at the settings, we can see that the output type is virtual, the view name is Nation data, and I don't currently have any post-output commands attached here. This will be what we're changing as part of this process for development. If we look at the mapping tab, we can see it's a pretty simple output. We have a custom ingestion nation source that then publishes out to this SQL view. And the first thing that I want to do, just to make sure that the view is actually created when I'm working with my custom loopback logic, is just reset this channel output here. And so that'll just kick off that output and make sure that that view is created. So this should finish pretty quickly. And then once this is complete, we can then start working on our Databricks notebook. Okay, it looks like it's complete. Now what we can do is actually go to Databricks. So we're going to open that up from the main menu. And then we're going to first check and make sure that our all-purpose compute is up and running. So I have this DataForge SDK cluster set up. You can use whichever settings you like. Since I'm in an AWS environment, I also have the instance profile attached to the cluster. But most importantly, I've attached the DataForge SDK jar to the libraries on the cluster. And if you don't remember how to set up this cluster or where to find this jar path, you can go back to DataForge, go to documentation, search for the SDK. And then within the SDK documentation, you can follow the creating an all-purpose cluster in Databricks guide here. And that'll help you with setting up your cluster as well as the actual jar location and finding the version that you're running in DataForge. So if we go back to Databricks, now that we've got our cluster up and running, we've got the SDK installed, the next thing that we're going to do is actually create a new notebook. And so I'm going to create this in my shared folder. Create a new notebook here and give it a name. So I'm going to stick with something fairly generic, but you want to make sure that you stick with a name that makes sense to you, that's easy to understand what's happening in the notebook. And once you've got that named, you're going to hover over the notebook name and you're going to copy out the notebook path. And then we're going to go back to DataForge and we're going to go to the output settings and we'll go to custom notebook for post output commands. And that'll allow us to select a cluster config, which we haven't created yet. So we're going to create a new cluster configuration here. And I'm going to call it custom loopback notebook. And we'll give it a description. And then I'm going to switch the scale mode to single node while I'm developing and switch job task type to custom notebook. And that'll allow me to paste in that notebook path to point to the specific notebook I want to run. So I can close this now, go back to my outputs, I can refresh the cluster configurations, and now I'll be able to select the custom loopback notebook cluster that we created in DataForge. So I'm going to save this. And now that I've got my output attached to the cluster, next thing I want to do is actually create that loopback source. So I go to sources, hit new, and then I'll give it a name. We'll stick with custom loopback nation. We'll give it a description, and then in the connection type, this will be where it starts to veer off from a regular loopback, which you would usually use a loopback here. But in this one, we're going to use a custom ingestion, and then we're going to select that exact same notebook cluster configuration that we attached to the output. So for schedule, I'm going to clear this out while I'm developing, and then same thing with retries here. Until I know that my notebook is working, I don't want it to launch retries. And so now I've got both my output setup and my source setup, and they're both attached to that same cluster configuration that's pointed to my notebook. So at this point, I'm ready to actually go work on the logic within the notebook. And an easy starting point, if you're not familiar with this pattern yet, is going to the documentation, and then go to custom post output. And if you scroll down a little bit, we actually have an example of the code that you can use for this pattern. So we paste that into the notebook, and you'll notice again that I'm working in Scala, just working with the DataForge SDK. The other thing is just making sure that the all-purpose compute is actually attached to this notebook, which it is currently. And then if we take a look at the code that we actually have in this example, so the first thing that we do is we do our standard imports. So we bring in the DataForge SDK, we bring in the Spark data frame, and then the pattern that we're going to follow for every custom loopback is basically going to be run a custom post output, and then within that custom post output session we're going to run a custom ingestion session, and then we'll close out the custom ingestion and we'll close out the post output. So this is where we start post output. We create our function within the post output to return a unit. Within that function we start our ingestion session. Then we define our function for the custom ingestion that returns a data frame. Then we close out the ingestion session and pass in that function that returns the data frame. And then lastly, we close out our post output session and passing in the post output function. So that's really the pattern that you follow. So even though the logic may look a little complex if you're not familiar with it, it's a pretty simple pattern to follow where you run the post output and then you trigger the custom ingestion within it, and then you close both out in the right order. The other couple things to note here before we get started, since I'm going to be running this from my Databricks notebook directly, I do need to pass in context for DataForge to know which output and which channel to start this post output session on. So when we're done developing, we know that the notebook's working, we'll come back in here and remove this. The other piece of this is for the custom ingestion portion of this. So normally, again, if you're familiar with custom ingestions, when you're running it from the Databricks notebook, you have to pass in the source name and the project name. Since with a custom loopback, it's technically always triggering from the notebook to start the new ingestion session. We do need to pass the source name and project name in. However, we don't want to hard code that in. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to grab the project name from the output process parameters, and then we will set up a custom parameter to define which source is the custom ingestion should actually point to. So that's how we're referencing the source name in here, as we grab a custom parameter from the output. Now the logic that I'm running within my custom loopback isn't crazy complex, but basically what I'm doing is my output runs and creates a virtual view, and that was called nation data. And then what I'm doing within my post output session is actually creating a second view within Databricks, and it's effectively just creating this custom post output view, and it's using a select star from the virtual output view as a starting point. And so this is where the bulk of your logic is going to go for a custom loopback. When you're writing your custom logic, it's either going to go in the post output session, or it's going to go within the custom ingestion session. It just depends on the use case that you need to build the custom loopback for, but primarily those are the two locations that you'll write your custom logic. So the next thing that I want to do is I do want to slightly modify the data that I'm sending into my custom ingestion. So rather than just creating a one-for-one SQL view and ingesting that, what I want to do is actually add a custom parameter to my output. So if I go to outputs and I open the output, I go to mapping, and then I'm going to my channel settings. I'm going to add my custom parameter directly in the channel, and I'm just going to name it tag, and we're going to tag the column as nation. Okay, so now that that's saved, I can actually reference that custom parameter in my notebook. So if I add a new val here, and I can reference the custom channel parameter, we're going to reference it very similarly as all the other parameters. It'll be the post output session.custom parameters, and then we'll have a backslash, and then in this case it's actually going to be the output channel, and then we'll name the parameter that we saved in there, and we'll save it as a string. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create this tag as a new column in my view. So I'm just going to reference that custom channel parameter, and I will name the new column channel tag. And so it looks like now we've basically got our working notebook. The last thing we're going to do is just replace our context up here for the post output session. So I'm going to go find the output name, Copy that and replace that in the notebook. And then we'll grab the channel name. So if I go to mapping and I look up my channel, I can grab that name here. And we're just going to replace it in this section. And then lastly, we just need the project name. So the project in this case is training. And so we will put that in here. And so now we've got a working notebook. So again, what we're doing, just one more time, is we're starting our post output session, specifically in the Sales Nation data output, and for this channel, this custom ingestion nation. And then what we're doing is grabbing a few process parameters to actually understand specifically where the output is and where it's writing to. So we're looking up the project name for the output, we're looking up the view database and the virtual view, and those are coming from the output settings. So we're grabbing the view name here, we're grabbing the view database down here, which is just the default. And then we have this custom parameter in here that is going to be destination source name. And we actually need to add this to our output still, which is something that I skipped originally. So within the output settings and the output parameters, we're going to add that as a custom parameter. And this is just going to name the source that we want to send the data to. And so I'm just using that custom loopback nation source that I created earlier. And so we'll save this. And so that'll define exactly where the custom ingestion gets sent to. And then next up we have our custom channel parameter, that's a tag. That's going to then get used as part of my post output session. When this runs, it's going to create a new view called custom post output. It'll add that in as a new column. And we're going to select from the view database and virtual view from the output. Then we're going to start up a new ingestion session. We're going to run our ingestion function. That's just going to basically do a select star from that new view we created. We'll close out the ingestion session, and then we'll close out the post output session. And so we'll give this a run now and make sure that the notebook works. So we can see that starting to run. So if I go back to DataForge and I go to my sources, I should be able to see that actually kicking off within DataForge here when it refreshes. So it looks like the post output session had already run by the time this refreshed. And we can see the new input that got created in our custom loopback, which is here, and it looks like that worked successfully. And lastly, we can verify that that did bring in all of the columns we wanted and added that additional channel tag column that I created as part of my custom loopback. So that's how you'd set up a custom loopback. The last thing that you'd want to do, again, just to operationalize your notebook, is to remove this context here. So now what'll happen is, if I wanted to run it from the Databricks notebook, I would need to add that back. However, now I can actually use this and kick off any processes directly from DataForge. So if I was to come to this source, this custom ingestion, start a new ingestion here, by the time it got to output, it would restart that custom loopback process, or I could reset output from here to trigger that again, and it won't need that context because it already knows what output and then what source to send it to. So again, that's how you'd set up your custom loopback. Obviously, there's many different use cases that you can build this for, but hopefully you like the training. If you have any feedback or questions, please reach out. Thank you.